Hi, everyone, and welcome to Mastering Historical Voice with Eric Weintraub. My name is Colin Mustful. I'm the founder and editor of History Through Fiction. We are the host of the workshop and also the publisher of Eric's novel, South of Sepharad. Eric published his novel back in February, so it's still a relatively new title. Let me just give you, in case you don't know much about the press, I'll just go over it real quick. So we're an independent press that publishes historical novels, and our niche is really that these novels are anchored in real historical people and historical events, and that our authors do extensive amounts of research in order to share these historical stories. Uh, Eric's novel is about the 1492 expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and Eric's novel is especially good at of sharing a time period that is very much different from our own contemporary time period. It's based in a different culture, at a much different time when English wouldn't have been used as a language, and so. But he's able to make it historically authentic without overwhelming the reader with actual vernacular of the time. So I've invited him to host this workshop in order to talk to other historical authors about how you find that balance between the authentic time period and something that contemporary readers will be able to understand. Um, so it's going to be a fairly straightforward workshop. Your cameras are on, your mics are open. If you're not speaking, please keep your microphones muted. But Eric will be doing some interaction. You can interact there in the chat, or you can interact on the video. Maybe raise your hand if you want to contribute in some way. This is being recorded after the event is over. I will send you the recording, and I will also send you the PowerPoint that Eric will be going through. All right, well, welcome everyone. If you could just say hello in the chat, let us know where you're joining us from, maybe what your work in progress is, why this class interests you, and I'd love to hear from you and just find out who is here. Without further ado then, let me introduce Eric Z. Weintraub, author of South of Sepharad.
Great, thank you so much, Colin. It's so great to meet you all. I'm really excited to teach this class. We have a lot to go over today. There's a lot of ground I want to cover, and I want to get us in the hour. So I'm just going to start with the presentation. If you have any questions along the way as we go, feel free to ask them. And then we'll hold out and have a longer discussion at the end. So, hey, everyone see my screen, Mastering Voice in Historical Fiction? Get a thumbs up?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so welcome to Mastering Voice in Historical Fiction. So I want to talk about voice today. And so what is voice? Well, agents want it and publishers want it, award-winning authors have it, but what exactly is it? And the reason that I bring this up is because when I first started writing fiction back in college, a teacher paid a very nice compliment to me and said, "Oh, your fiction has a great voice to it." And I was sort of embarrassed because I didn't actually know what she was talking about. Um, there's so many mechanics of literature that are discussed so often, such as plot, setting, character, dialogue. But I feel that voice is so important, and yet it's so rarely discussed or taught. It's almost perceived as the kind of thing that's like pure talent or something you do or don't have. And I don't think that's true because I think that voice can be taught. And so today I want to go over voice and how it works with historical fiction specifically. So let's talk about, first of all, what is voice in literature? So you'll see here that it's actually kind of a laundry list of things. Voice can be the way a story sounds, the syntax, the rhythm of the narration, whether there's regional dialect, foreign language, tons of stuff. And if this looks a little overwhelming, that's okay, because we're really going to go through this throughout the workshop and really understand what this is, and so that it becomes natural and doesn't become this sort of checklist of things you need to do to give your novel a strong narrative voice. And a couple things, voice is not, it's not dialogue. While many of the things that we're going to cover today can go towards dialogue and be used for dialogue, mostly the voice we're going to talk about is specific, the voice of the narrator. Also, it's not a one size fits all approach. Voice is going to change depending on the author and also might depend on the project. Sometimes there are some authors who their voice stays consistent throughout their entire body of work. And there are some authors who every single book has a completely different voice. And we're going to explore both kinds of those authors today. So first of all, let's get an example, a few quick examples of what voice is. So what I have here is an example of a very strong voice, one of the strongest voices in English literature, to my opinion. But I'm not telling you who it is yet. So I want to know, would someone mind reading this out loud to the class and taking a guess at who this is?
His breeding, sir, hath been at my charge. I have so often blushed to acknowledge him that now I am brazen to it. Shakespeare?
Exactly. Perfect. This is from King Lear by William Shakespeare. Even though this is not his most widely performed play, you could tell who it was just by one line of dialogue. Let's do two more. Can someone read this one and take a guess at who it is?
I can read again if nobody else is. By the way, this is Carla Hagen, and I'm having a hard time. I may have to go out and come back in because I can't enlarge the screen or get in the chat. There was no trail that the young man could see, but they were working up and around the face of the mountain. And now they crossed a stream, and the old man went steadily on. I head up the edge of the rocky stream Hemingway, I presume.
Yes, exactly. This is from For Whom the Bell Tolls, and we can immediately see his voice from his sort of terse declarative sentences and the way it's very much straight and to the point. Now I just want to do one more. Carla, would you mind reading this one before you leave this
Sure.
back?
All right. For having lived in Westminster, how many years now? Over 20. One feels even in the midst of the traffic or waking at night, Clarissa was positive, a particular hush or solemnity, an indescribable pause, a suspense, but that might be her heart, affected, they said, by influenza before Big Ben strikes. There.
Do you know who
Oh,
this is? This one's a little harder.
Virginia Woolf? Probably not.
No, it
No.
is. It is Virginia Woolf.
Oh, it is. Oh, geez.
Virginia
Okay.
Woolf. And as you can immediately see, this looks very different from Hemingway. This is, we have all sorts of question marks, parentheses, M dashes. This is a longer sentence. And the reason I bring up these three examples is with voice, it's not always easy to make a definition of voice, but it's very easy to know it when we see it. With these three authors who were some of the most famous, respected authors in the English language. They have a unique voice to them that is almost immediately identifiable. Now, the goal of this class is not to develop such a unique voice that people can tell who you are without even being able to, without knowing the title of the book or your name, although that would certainly be nice. But I just wanted to show some extreme examples to show how much voice can portray who an author is, even if we don't know the setting or the character or the plot or anything. So one question some people might ask, does my novel really need a strong voice? So I would actually say yes and no. I think that a strong voice can aid your mission in becoming a more literary light writer and set yourself apart from your peers, as the three authors that we just discussed did. But I will say that there are plenty of books every year that get published that have little to no voice to speak of, and those novels are all very successful. So it's really a matter of personal preference. If you enjoy reading books with a strong voice, it's probably worthwhile to work on a book that has a strong voice. Um, and then it also happens to do with the kind of thing you're writing. I always think that there's room for voice in any sort of project, but it might lend itself better to certain types of projects, certain types of historical fiction, things like that. So I want to talk about what is a unique dilemma that I think historical fiction authors, including myself, face with voice. That's generally with voice. It's easier to find a voice when you're writing from your own personal experience, such as if you're writing a book about, something that happened to you when you were a kid or something that happened to you, when you're in school, it's going to be easier to sort of pull from the the way you talk, the way people you know talk, the environment you grow up in. But with historical fiction, it's a little different because in historical fiction, we're often writing from outside our own lived experience. So now there are exceptions to that, of course, but by and large, we are going to have to write about people that are different from ourselves. One moment, I just want to make sure that no one else is waiting to be let in to the waiting room. Okay, well, anyways, let me continue. The farther into history we go, the less of a record we have of a person's voice. One example I like to make of this is there are a million books out there that are written about Joan of Arc, novels about Joan of Arc that are written from her perspective. And yet we don't know what Joan of Arc sounded like. We don't know what she thought was funny. We don't know if she was witty. And that is a common occurrence that you'll have, especially the farther you go back into historical fiction. It's a situation I faced myself with a book written in 1492. So given this sort of unique dilemma that we historical fiction authors have that literary writers and genre writers don't typically have is how do you create an authentic voice when you don't know how people from the past spoke? So I want to start by talking about my own personal experience with writing South of Sephiroth, the book that Colin mentioned at the beginning of this workshop. So something unique that I faced with finding the voice for this novel is I'm an Angelino living in the 21st century, and I'm writing about Spanish Jews in the 15th century. So also on top of that, the book is written in English for an English-speaking audience, but the characters are essentially speaking Spanish in their world of the novel. So there's already a lot of idioms and colloquialisms that, we might take for granted speaking now that just wouldn't work and wouldn't be authentic to this time period. So something I faced as I was starting to write my novel is they speak and think so differently from me. So how do I write honestly from their perspective? So there's a bunch of things I did. And the reason I want to talk about my novel before we get into a voice from other works of literature is that this is the only novel that we can take a peek under the hood and figure out exactly how someone arrives at the voice for their novel. So the first thing I did for South of Sephiroth was I tried reading texts that were published during the time period of my novel. Poems from 1492, a play from the 1400s, even the Alhambra Decree, which is the decree that Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand passed down to expel the Jews from Spain, which is sort of the catalyst of my novel. Now, this was helpful from a research point, but didn't provide a eureka moment. So this is just an example of what one of these texts looked like. This is a passage from the Alhambra Decree. And I'm not going to make you read it. You don't even need to really read this, but just look at it for a second and just see how completely verbose this is. This is all, one long line of one long sentence. It almost reads like a medieval version of sort of a lawyer contract jargon. So I knew that even though if I wrote something that looked like this, it would probably be pretty authentic to the time period, but it would have been overly stylized, and I feel that it would have kept the reader at arm's length. Even myself, this is a lot to take in just looking at this one paragraph. So I knew, and what I recommend too is that while we want to be authentic to the time period we're writing in, it's still good to write for the 21st century audience in mind. Entertainment is still important. Accessibility is still important. So that's why I recommend do the research for read text from your time period, but it's not necessary that you must write as they wrote. So when I was trying to figure out the voice for South of Sephiroth, I first wrote without committing to a voice because I couldn't really figure out what to write. I knew I couldn't write it like some of those texts. And as a result, and maybe you've faced this situation in your own works in progress, my descriptions and internal monologue were very plain and informational. And I want to give you an example from the very first draft of my novel. This is a scene where the main character, he's been in the wilderness for a couple weeks trying to get from Granada to Malaga, where he's going to leave Spain. And he stops at a town called Periana to find water and gather supplies. And I'm just going to read this example from the first draft. The wall was built diagonally on the hill, with the entrance at the bottom and the town sloping back up the hillside toward the mountain summit. From his vantage point, Vidal could see over the wall to the orange-tiled roofs of the town's houses. A church with the matching roof towered at the lower end of town. Now, I think with this, my personal own opinion on this is that if you're just trying to start writing and get everything down on paper, this isn't bad. You have to start somewhere, and this is hopefully you can at least picture where he is. But it's sort of a workman-like description. The wall was built diagonally on the hill. I'm not even looking back, and I'm not even sure what that means. There's a lot of attention paid to the tiled roofs of the house, even though obviously there would be much more to take in than just the roofs. And I think when there's a lack of voice, as this has, the thing I always say is kind of reads like anyone could have written it. So it was important to write something that's more artistic and feels more specific to myself and specific to the character telling the story. So this is that same passage as it reads in the published work. Um, I'll read this also. The city was built on the side of the mountain. Its labyrinthine streets and hill-dwelling houses reminded Vidal of El Albaicin, where a short house could be closer to the heavens than a tall one by pure virtue of where its original builders settled on the hillside. Was this what El Albaicin might have looked like if the rest of Granada had never been developed around it? The question made him yearn to look upon Granada again. So really, this is the same kind of scene. The only difference is that I'm trying to write it from the perspective of the main character. So he's been in the wilderness for 2 weeks, so now he's coming across a town. He notices labyrinthine streets, hill-dwelling houses. Also, a big theme of this novel is religion and how it affects people. So tying with that theme, a short house is closer to the heavens than by virtue, having trouble saying that word, by where it's settled on the hill. He's also homesick. He's thinking about Granada, and this town reminds him of a neighborhood in Granada. So this is all ways to inject a voice into the narrative while still telling the story, but not making it so plain informational. It's more told from the perspective of the character. So how exactly did I discover this voice? So I decided to go heavy on description. I realized that while I couldn't write something that per se sounds like it was written by someone in 15th century Spain, I could still describe the sensory details of the place as they were perceived by the protagonist. And I also knew that I wanted to write the novel in third person, and we're going to talk more about points of view a little later in this session. But I felt that because this is a epic historical novel, it deserved a epic historical voice, which is often classically the third person. And I also wrote it so that we could be privy to Vidal's thoughts and attitudes, which helps create a more natural, individual sounding voice. I will say that this wasn't a eureka moment. I wasn't discovered overnight. The more I wrote, the more comfortable and familiar I became with the voice, and it was more that the voice started to develop on its own. And in a way, you'll find with voice that it could be a snowball effect. At first, you'll kind of be, trying to figure it out. Is this right for me? Is this the way this book should sound? And over time, as you write the novel and you get more confident, it starts to become more natural. Also, I couldn't have found this voice before I understood who my main character was as a person. And the voice, it's very helpful because the voice will help influence who the main character is. The main character will help influence how the voice sounds. So there's sort of this symbiotic relationship. I will say that even though writing with voice will help you guide your story, sometimes you have to write the story to find the voice, which is what I did at first. I just wrote this plain sort of informational version of the story before I was able to figure out what the voice is. So now I want to talk about different approaches to voice in historical fiction. And do we have any questions before we keep going? Just looking in the chat. Perfect.
Eric, did you get any kind of validation when you were discovering your voice? Hearing back from any early readers?
I did. So I was lucky that I had a professor that I was able to have take a look at it because he felt that the voice was weak to begin with, including he'd actually read that example that I showed you. And he helped encourage more sensory details. And at first I wasn't sure. I thought that that would turn into what's called purple prose, which is, it just kind of feels like it's being show-offy for the sake of it. But over time I started to realize, the sensory detail is really helping distinguish not just how this place looks, but how it looks to the main character. And outside validation can be very helpful. And the great thing about voice too is you don't always have to ask a reader to read your entire novel. Sometimes you just have to ask them to read a page or two and say, does this voice sound gripping? Is it confident? Is it well written? And that's the great thing about voices. You could sometimes develop it without necessarily having to develop all the other aspects of a story. So I want to dive into different approaches to voice in historical fiction. And let's start with point of view, something that I mentioned briefly a little earlier, but I want to take a deeper dive. So point of view, there's a few different types of it, and probably most of you know this already, so I'll go over this pretty quickly. First person, I picked up the sword. First person, plural, we picked up the swords. Second person, you picked up the sword. Third person, he, she, or they picked up the sword. Um, Now, I will say that making a book first or third does not make it inherently better or worse. I actually think that it's really a personal opinion, personal feeling of how you want to write your story. I know sometimes people have strong opinions on whether a book should have been written in first or third. And honestly, every book I've ever read, I've never said, oh man, that book was so great, but if only it had been written in first person instead of third. So I think it really is up to you and what you think is best for the story. Um, Also, you might start realizing that as you're writing your book that, you've been writing in first, but maybe it should be written in third. And you could always go back and change it later. I actually think it's underrated how easy it is to change the point of view from first to third or vice versa if you find that maybe you're inspired to write it take a different approach to it. Also, for this workshop, I'm only going to focus on first person and third person, just because the other two are so uncommon. But of course, at the end with the discussion, we can, of course, talk about those more if you like. So we're going to talk about first historical fiction in the first person only first, and then we'll move to third after that. So there are some pros for writing historical fiction in first person, and I actually think that they actually work pretty well for anything you're writing, whether it's historical fiction or literary fiction, etc. The great thing about first person narrator is it's usually a dramatized protagonist. For example, I talked about a made up Joan of Arc book earlier. First person would be Joan of Arc is narrating the story. So it recounts an experience as it's happening to the protagonist. Um, some of the other pros is this makes it easier to get inside the head of the protagonist and can lead to unique writing styles, thoughts, and perspectives. You'll usually find as you get to know your main character better that they'll sort of almost take the book from you and you'll be able to start writing it as they perceive things and it becomes a little more natural of a flow. It also helps the identity of your protagonist doubles as the identity, I'm sorry, of the narrator. So, you kind of get to do two things at once. Although, of course, sometimes there can be a contrast to this. For example, maybe you have a character who's very passive when they're speaking or acting, but in their head they're just, they're just on fire with all these opinions. So that's something you could do to build contrast too, or you can make them very similar on the inside and outside. Of course, there are some cons for writing historical fiction in the first person. I think the most common one is that you're tethered to one protagonist for the whole novel. Well, obviously, people do this all the time. It can be a little challenging, especially say you have if you have antagonists who are sort of plotting and scheming, you can't always go and show a scene of what they're trying to do to your protagonist. So everything is sort of filtered through only what one person can see. Um, I also think, and this is something I don't hear enough, but I think that this is important. Matching the voice with the personality of a character can be tricky. So, for example, let's say you're writing a historical fiction novel that takes place from the point of view of a 10-year-old. Well, you want to be able to pick up on the thoughts and attitudes and writing of a 10-year-old. You don't want to do such a good job that your book actually reads like it was written by a 10-year-old. This can be one of those little mistakes that you make as you're figuring it out. I know I've made a mistake like this in the past. So it can be challenging, especially considering what kind of person you're writing from the perspective of. So now I want to go and analyze some voices. We're going to do something similar to what I did earlier with the Virginia Woolf and Shakespeare examples. I'm going to show you a few passages from different well-known historical fiction books, and I want to discuss what's working in the book and what's making it unique. And to avoid bias, I won't reveal the title or author until after we've discussed. In fact, if you happen to know who wrote the book or what the book is, don't tell anyone yet, because I want people to be able to analyze the voice on its own, and then I'll reveal who wrote it. Also, please compliment what's working, but don't be afraid to critique as well. I think that's important that we can learn from other authors. It's not to be catty, but it's so that we can really start to uncover what we like and what we don't like and how we can take it and use it for our work. So this is the first example. I'd like to call on anyone who would like to read this to the class so we can because I want to be able to have us hear how it sounds and not just read it. Would someone mind reading this for me?
I can read it, Eric.
Okay, that sounds good, Colin.
You may have noticed how much of what I've told you already is hearsay. Someone saw something and told me, and I told you. Well, in some cases, I've simplified it even more than it really was and have repeated or will repeat fourth or fifth hand information. That's the way it is here. The grapevine is very real, and you have to use it if you're going to stay ahead. Also, of course, you have to know how to pick out the grains of truth from the chaff of lies, rumors, and wish it had been done's.
Thank you. So, any observations on this right off the bat? What are we seeing about the voice that maybe makes it unique, that makes it look individual? Any takers?
It's kind of convoluted. I mean, he's explaining something, the narrator's explaining something to theoretically make it, I think it, how can I say, understandable. And yet, and it is, but it isn't. His language is convoluted, is what I mean to say. I mean, the ideas are not, but the language for the second sense where he has a parenthetical phrase. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Interesting. So for you, this feels more like it's very, I'd say it's very conversational. So it's
Mhm.
maybe it doesn't paint the most vivid picture of a scene. Is that what makes it a little convoluted to you, Carla?
I think so. That and the language.
Okay. Anyone else want to give their thoughts on this before I go and talk about it a little more?
This is Ted. I'm just, it's very defensive. And so he's basically qualifying the quality of what he's telling you, but he's also putting out the challenge that, I've had to obviously separate the good stuff from the less good.
Interesting. So the attitude it's taking is defensive, and I think that's helpful. It's helpful that it shows that they have an opinion on something. And sometimes when things have a lack of a voice, there's not much of a it's more like just reporting the facts like a newspaper. So there's an opinion here. So that's great. So let's talk about where this comes from. So this actually comes from a novella from Stephen King's different seasons. It's called Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, turned into the famous movie Shawshank Redemption. So it's historical fiction, takes place 1938 to 1958 in a state penitentiary in Maine. And a couple things I want to point out that I think we've talked about. It's very conversational. Um, some of the words feel old-timey. So some of the words such as chafe of lies, rumors, wish it had been. I think that's a way to inject a little bit of history without going over the top with it. That's the kind of thing that those aren't the kind of words that I think I hear a lot in modern time. And what's going on here is he's describing the intricacies of prison, which maybe is a little convoluted. I think that it might even, I didn't think about this, but now that Carla mentions it, it could be that it's convoluted because how this world works is convoluted. My hope is that the hope of Stephen King is to inspire confidence in the reader. Of course, maybe that would be something that's a little easier to see if you were able to read more of it. But it is showing how prison operates. So I want to do another passage. This is from a completely different book. Can I ask someone to read this passage?
Hi, my father was a king and the son of kings. He was a short man, as most of us were, and built like a bull, all shoulders. He married my mother when she was 14 and sworn by the priestess to be faithful. It was a good match. She was an only child, and her father's fortune would go to her husband.
Thanks, Leslie. Do you have any thoughts on this off the bat? And again, there's no right or wrong answers.
No, because when I read, I can't think at the same time.
Oh, that's fine. You're focusing on the performance.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Any thoughts on this, on the way the voice operates?
This
Well,
seems like someone that may have grown up in like a diplomatic society, or they are accustomed to rules and structure.
That's good. I mean, I think one thing that along those lines, one thing that helps here is that it's revealing some information without outright saying it. There's a few things that are dropped in here, like uh, king, priestess. So immediately, even though we don't know what time period this play takes place in, it probably isn't taking place in modern day, which I think can be a unique way to write. You know, sometimes with historical fiction, we'll put something like Greece 400 BC at the the top by the chapter title. But sometimes it helps to sort of sneak in some facts and details before we kind of to sort of help the reader figure out where they are. And this is actually the opening lines of this book. So this book is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Only came out a few years ago. Very famous, popular book. It's a retelling of the Trojan War. And a few things that I picked up on this voice just by reading this excerpt. It's a young narrator. The voice sounds very youthful. I'd say almost simplistic. I actually think that this is a little overly modern. I think the line "all shoulders" he was referring to the way his father appears is even a little vague, a little lazy. But this is for a younger audience, and sometimes that can be maybe that's the way that the narrator is supposed to perceive his father. And as I mentioned earlier, this is gives us some subtle hints about where we are with words like king and priestess. I'm going to do one more for the first person, and this one's a little different. Can I have one more person read this one before we move on to third?
I'd actually love to read this, if you don't mind.
Yeah, you want to go for it?
Yeah. Dare I admit it? Dare I confess? America, land of supermarkets and superhighways, of supersonic jets and Superman, of supercarriers and the Super Bowl. America, a country not content simply to give itself a name on its bloody birth, but one that insisted for the first time in history on a mysterious acronym, USA, a trifecta of letters outdone later only by the quartet of the USSR. Although every country thought itself superior in its own way, was there ever a country that coined so many super terms from the federal bank with its narcissism, was not only super confident, but also truly super powerful, that would not be satisfied until it locked every nation of the world in a full Nelson and made it cry Uncle Sam? It was fun. So over the top, satirical, fun, and funny.
Very good. Yeah, it's playful. That's right.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Any thoughts?
Definitely not a fan of America.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely there's an attitude here. Absolutely. And it's revealing rather than saying like I hate America, it's more so saying the problems and sort of a sarcastic tone that it takes. That you can pick up on the sarcastic tone, even though it's just letters on a page. One question, what's happening in this scene? What is the character doing? Where is this taking place? And this isn't dialogue.
Almost sounds like the speaker is either giving a speech or on the witness stand. I mean, it's clearly a speech of some sort, or
Yeah.
a soliloquy, if you will.
So it is, and actually, there was a bit of a trick question. This actually is nothing's actually being dramatized here. The author is essentially just I'm sorry, not the author. The narrator is sort of just going on this soliloquy that is purely telling based. I know that's writing 101 is show don't tell, but sometimes when you tell, that is a fantastic opportunity for voice. I don't really know if you were to depict this, through showing, you might have to show several scenes of a character walking around and sort of being upset at like Superman in the Super Bowl, which probably would not be very engaging. But because it's more written in this not stream of consciousness, but heavy interior monologue style, we're able to get this attitude from the narrator that we maybe wouldn't get if it was a traditional scene. So this is from the book The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. Takes place in 1970s, so not still counts as historical fiction, although obviously a bit more of a recent book. Takes place in Vietnam and California. It's very playful, isn't afraid to tell rather than show. I'd say there's a great rhythm to these words. Also, there's a heavy use of alliteration. He says Super Bowl, super highway, super carriers, things like that. And what's interesting about this book is that while it was heavily praised for the sort of literary acrobatics that it's able to pull off, some critics also found it a bit unbelievable that the the narration doesn't quite line up with the character, and I think some people accuse the author of this being more like just sort of like showing off that they're good at writing. So that's one thing that obviously worked in his favor. As you can see, this book's won a few pretty big awards. But it's also something to figure out where you want to fall on that. Do you want to write something? Do you want to write something that's believable to the character? Do you want to write something that's more just literary for the sake of art? These are all things that you can explore. I had one more example that I'm going to skip past. That was for Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield. But if anyone's interested, we could always come back to that one at the end. Because I want to get into historical fiction, the third person now. So there are different types of third persons to distinguish. You don't need to keep these definitions top of mind, but it's just a helpful thing to know. There's the implied author, where they have a specific identity, but they're never named. I'd say Hemingway was a master of this. All of his books sound pretty much like that passage from For Whom the Bell Tolls. He has a consistent identity throughout his entire body of work, even though, sometimes he did write in first person, but many times he wrote in third, but he always had that terse, to the point style. There's the undramatized narrator. This is also, I think, more commonly known as close third person, where the author filters the narrative through a conscience similar to the characters. I always find this to be prevalent in Southern literature, especially, where even though it'll be a third person narrator, they'll sort of talk in that same twang that some of the characters in the South speak with. Faulkner is a big example of this. And then there's, of course, the omniscient narrator who merely reports the facts. And I would actually argue, especially in our modern day, that omniscient narrator is the most difficult to pull off. It's the most, when I'm reading something, 9 times out of 10, I don't notice the voice or the whether it's in first or third, but usually if someone's writing omniscient narrator, they're not quite getting it right. It usually sticks out. And we'll go over examples of all of these in just a minute. So Carla, would you mind reading this next passage? And then again, we're talking about third person now, so it's going to be a little different. It's not from the perspective of a narrator.
Here it was pitch dark, but he groped along unerringly to find the right door in the gathering furor. He slid the door open and jumped for the figure that lay on the futon, but his knife arm was caught by a vice-like grip, and now he was thrashing in combat on the floor. He fought with cunning, broke free, and slashed again, but missed, entangled with a quilt. He hurled it off and threw himself at the figure, knife poised for the death thrust. But the man twisted with unexpected agility, and a hardened floor dug into his groin. Pain exploded in him as his victim darted for safety.
Thank you. So what are we getting from the scene? What are we seeing?
Great action, movement, rhythm. We're there. It's immediate.
Exactly. And I think that one thing that's important with this is actually a fight scene in a book, which I find that is something that is, I think, rarer in books that I read for whatever reason. But I think one thing that it's doing here is that it's there's action, there's movement, but it's not just stage direction blocking. It's not just he walked into the room, he opened the door, he stabbed him. There's a little bit more going on here too. The knife arm was caught by a vice-like grip, thrashing in combat. There's some real description here. Anyone else? Any thoughts on this passage?
I like that it's not overly revealing. Like the character doesn't, there's so much chaos in what he knows and doesn't know. And the narrator could reveal all the information, but I think because it's a close third person, they're only giving as much information as the character has.
Great, absolutely. So
Also,
this. Oh, sorry, go. Oh, I just spoiled it. Sorry, go ahead, Carla.
Also really good use of verbs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that it's very well written, but also very clean and simple. This is from Shogun by James Clavell, which was recently turned into a very popular Hulu show. Takes
I
place
could not stand the show. I could not do it.
I had some issues with the ending actually, but that'll be a conversation for maybe we can save that for the end. But still the book, it's based on been a very successful book. I've had several people that randomly I've met in my life who've I've asked their favorite book, they've said Shogun, which I'm always very surprised by, but seems to really reach certain people. So a few notes on this voice that I think you guys pretty much picked up on, so I won't spend too much time on this. This reporting the action, but there's some voice used to keep with the state to prevent this from becoming stage directions. I even think some sentences are a little lazy. Pain exploded in him. I think that kind of sounds like it's one of those things like kind of sounds like anyone could have written it. But for the most part, it's simple to the point. It's not showing off. Um, Also, this is an epic book written from the point of view of many characters. So the voice does stay consistent throughout the novel, which I think is one to have, especially, it's a novel of different cultures, different people meeting. So maybe a voice that's a little more to the point is helpful to sort of reach across that wide cast of characters. So I'm actually going to skip this one because this is actually a little similar and I want to make sure we keep moving. This is from Wolf Hall. If there are any big Wolf Hall fans, we could absolutely come back to this one at the end, but I want to make sure we cover a few different things. Can I have someone read this passage, please?
In a corner of the city, inside a tall, narrow house at number 4 Rue Vauborel, on the 6th and highest floor, a sightless 16-year-old named Marie-Laure Leblanc kneels over a low table covered entirely with a model. The model is a miniature of the city she kneels within and contains scale replicas of the hundreds of houses and shops and hotels within its walls. There's the cathedral with its perforated spire and the bulky old Chateau de Saint-Malo, and row after row of seaside mansions studded with chimneys. A slender wooden jetty arcs out from a beach called the Plage de Mole. A delicate reticulated atrium vaults over the seafood market. Minute benches, something, the smallest, no larger than apple seeds, dot the, I can't see the words, squares.
Dot the tiny public squares. Thank you.
Okay,
And
sorry.
thank you for covering the French words as well.
You're welcome.
So this is a very different kind of writing than the last example. Does anyone want to any thoughts on this one?
It's so visual, so detailed, that it's I think that's extraordinarily engaging.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean it really goes. I don't want to give too much away yet, but it absolutely goes and shows you so much that's going on in this scene.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on this one? Does anyone want to venture a guess of what kind of third person narrator this is? It was one of the three that we discussed at the beginning.
I bet it's omniscient.
Right. This is omniscient. And I think that this is actually omniscient done extraordinarily well, even though I think that it's often the hardest one to pull off. So this is from All the Light I Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, a book that was a massive hit, huge award winner, takes place in World War II France. And a few notes on this that we've already covered. We're covering these well. It's distant, practically omniscient, but it also has loads of description. Just to go back to it for a second, not only is it sort of showing us the room we're in, but it's able to paint the entire picture of this town, the way the cathedral looks, the way the beach looks, the names of places that maybe wouldn't be top of mind for the characters. There's even some things here that I'm surprised by when I take a closer look at it. The main character is just declared to be a sightless 16-year-old. When they say show don't tell, you'd think maybe they would show that this person is blind and is, trying to feel for something, things like that. But just the author just goes for it and says exactly who she is. It's very declarative. I'll say that this is, like I said, this is one of the hardest things to pull off. This book also took this author 10 years to write. So I'm sure every single decision in this entire book was poured over meticulously. But I think that it really works well in being vivid while also being able to show this grand sort of godlike view of the setting. All right. So can I have someone read this one?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
They rode on into the mountains, and their way took them through high pine forests, wind in the trees, lonely bird calls. The shoeless mules slaloming through the dry grass and pine needles. In the blue coolest on the north slopes, narrow tailings of old snow. They rode up switchbacks through a lonely aspen wood where the fallen leaves lay like golden disklets in the damp black trail. The leaves shifted in a million spangles down the pale corridors, and Glanton took one and turned it like a tiny fan by its stem and held it and let it fall, and its perfection was not lost on him. Wow.
Thank you. You said, wow, what's your reaction to this?
But because first of all, I didn't even, I mean, the vocabulary, the verbs are amazing. They're just so evocative of what is of the place. I just think the description is stunning. And that it kind of takes a they're riding into the mountains. Their way took them through high pine forest, wind in the trees, and lonely bird calls. And then you scale it down to the leaves shifted in a million spangles. And Glanton took one. So it goes from this huge view into a very tiny microcosm of the whole scene. And I just think it's stunning.
That's amazing. That's exactly how I feel about this book. I think it's one of the most beautiful books ever written, and it does go from that macro to micro very quickly. And that's remarkable that you picked up on that in just one paragraph. That's wonderful. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this passage? If not, we can keep going. So this is from Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah.
I think one of the most beautifully written novels ever, although it is also one of the most violent things I've ever read. So reader discretion is advised. Takes place in 1850, American Southwest in Mexico. And notes on this voice, as Leslie pointed out, the language is distant and poetic, but it also goes down to that micro level. And one thing that's so surprising about this book is it's so beautiful, but it's talking about some of the most ugly and horrific acts you can imagine occur in this book. Basically, it's about a group of marauders who roam the countryside killing people. So it's almost a sharp duality, contradiction between the way it's written, the beauty of the nature, and sort of the violence of things that are being portrayed within the novel. Also, I thought it was funny, Leslie, that you got caught on a few words such as callous in particular.
Yeah.
That's because McCarthy isn't afraid to use archaic words. He's even sometimes known to make up make-believe words and put them into his novel to see if anyone notices. But I think that a little goes a long way with something like this, where for the most part, it's pretty easy to read. But because it takes place in 1850, every now and then he's able to insert something to really bring you into that time period and talk about something that is very specific. Also, one thing I'll say about this book that's unique is there's almost no interior monologue in any of the book. McCarthy's purely writing from scenery. Very hard thing to do. Probably not the right choice for everybody, but he's so good at it that he gets away with it. And almost, reading this novel is almost like watching a beautifully made film. It's really a spectacular book. So we have two more that I want to go over that talk about something that's specific to third person. Can I have someone read this passage?
Miss
I'll
Ted.
go
Give it a
again.
shot.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Ted.
Go, Ted.
The first thing Tony thought of doing, sitting behind the wheel in his car, about to turn on the ignition, was drive out to Belmont's Roadhouse and tell him what was afoot. He knew for a fact there wasn't anything harmful about the whiskey. He wasn't sure about the girls, but they appeared healthy and fun-loving. A cutie out there named Elodie had caught his eye. Yeah, what he should do, let Belmont know the two-gut weasel was coming on a raid.
Thank you, Ted. Any thoughts about this, including perhaps what kind of third person narrator this is?
Is it close third?
This is close third, absolutely.
I like close third because it tells you so much about in a natural way about the narrator. You have access to the narrator's thoughts, and I like that. I think that's great.
I agree. I'm a big fan of close third as well. So this is like I the example earlier of Southern literature often reads like this. So even though with this story, this is an undramatized narrator, but the narrator is really speaking in the same language and vernacular as the characters in this book, and it almost reads like someone's sort of monologuing the whole book to you, and it really brings you into the book. It brings you very close to the characters. So this is from The Hot Kid by Elmore Leonard. Elmore Leonard is actually considered one of the great genre writers, but he wrote genre historical fiction. And I wanted to make sure I gotta mix it up a little bit and put someone like him in here. This takes place during the Great Depression in the 1920s. You could say close third, conversational. He's using the language of the characters afoot and two guy weasel. And also there's what's called free indirect discourse in here, which I'm going to go over in just a second. Redirect discourse is what he should do. That's a kind of very conversational, I think, even for a narrator. So I want to talk a little bit more about what that is, and I'll show you one final example of that. So for free indirect discourse, every time I see this term, my eyes kind of glaze over. I'm like, that sounds super complicated. What is that? That sounds like something that I'm not sure I want to deal with, but it's actually very simple, and I just want to break down what it is. It's a form of narration written in the third person while maintaining essences of the first person. I'm sorry. It allows the author to describe the inner workings of their characters while still remaining in the third person. So an example in traditional third person would be, this is just an example I made up. This is from a book. Vivian thought she was pretty and she believed that was the most important thing she could be. But if you were to write this as free indirect discourse, it would say she was pretty and that was everything. So really I'm getting rid of words like thought and believed because those create a certain distance between the character and the reader, because we're seeing that artificially this is being filtered through thoughts the author is telling us. But with free and direct discourse, the author is able to just declare it as the character might in their own mind. So this last example I'm going to show you is loaded with free and direct discourse. Can I have someone read this example?
Counting on the stillness of her soul, she had forgotten the other one, the soul of her baby girl. Who would have thought that a little old baby could harbor so much rage? Rutting among the stones under the eyes of the engraver's son was not enough. Not only did she have to live out her years in a house, palsied by the baby's fury at having its throat cut, but those 10 minutes she spent pressed up against dawn-colored stone studded with star chips, her knees wide open as the grave, were longer than life, more alive, more pulsating, that the baby blood that soaked her fingers like oil.
Thank you, Leslie. So this is free and direct discourse. Anything in particular you guys want to point out, take a look at? Anything that sticks out to you?
The vocabulary is beautiful. Well, I know what this is, so I can't I can't say much more.
That's fine. I hope anyone else any other comments people want to make on this before I'll say what it is and say a little bit more about it.
Well, it seems like something you wouldn't express outside of your own inner thoughts and feelings.
Absolutely. It is able to really dig deep into the character and how they feel in a way that they might not be able to act out or announce through dialogue. I will say that and you can do this in any sort of narration style, but there's a rhetorical question: who would have thought the little old baby could harbor so much rage? There's lots of things going on here that are still in third, but really filtered through the thoughts of this main character. So this is from Beloved by Toni Morrison, a book that many consider in the running for the great American novel. Post-Civil War 1800s, takes place in the U.S. And like pretty much everything we went over already, close third, the narrator almost sounds like the main character, and there's heavy use of free and direct discourse, which is really your friend when you're writing. It can help with bringing a closer distance between the reader and the character. So that was all I had for the examples, and I want to move into just the last section of this presentation, which is just a few like rapid fire tips to find your voice. And then we can go into a discussion, and I'd love to hear more about your projects and anything we can discuss to help figure out the voices in your projects. Tip number one, I think it helps to write characters who like to talk, especially in the first person. While you could write from the perspective of someone who's a person of few words, it helps if they have specific attitudes, such as sarcasm we went over earlier, that can help sort of bolster how they write, and it'll make it easier to discover that voice because they enjoy talking, they enjoy describing a scene and things like that. Tip number two, when you start your work in progress, try different approaches to voice, such as different points of view. You'd be surprised when inspiration will strike. You can maybe start by writing first and think, oh, actually the story should be told from the perspective of a few characters. Maybe it should be third or vice versa. And it really is as easy as sometimes a little more nuanced than this, but sometimes it's as easy as doing a find replace in Word to at least kind of see what it looks like in a different style. Tip number three, this is actually something I started doing recently. Record how you talk. You can even use the recorder app on your phone, or record a page you've written, because sometimes what we see, we will pick up different things with our ears than our eyes will. So it sometimes helps to read it aloud, see how well it flows, if there's any bumps anywhere, see what you can actually hear what the voice sounds like, even though reading is essentially a visual medium. Tip number four, this one is hard one for me. It's hard to invent a voice out of thin air. Like I was saying at the beginning when I was talking about my own example for South of Sephiroth, I was trying to figure out how exactly people from the 1500s would talk. And the more I realized, or talk or think, the more I realized that I can't just come up with some sort of vague understanding or interpretation of how they might have been. I need to base them off someone. So don't be, even though you're writing historical fiction, don't be afraid to base a character off someone you know. I've gotten some resistance to this advice in the past, but because it's like, if I'm writing a story that takes place in ancient Mesopotamia, why would I base a character off of my uncle or something? But it's just a jumping off point, and you'd be surprised that it's so much easier to find a voice when you're kind of taking a little bit from real life, something and you can evolve them into someone that fits in that time period. But it's a great starting point. I'll say most of the characters in my novel are in some way based off either an aspect of myself or someone I know. It doesn't have to be just you're taking someone and putting them into your story, but it helps to figure out if someone has a specific way of talking, a specific attitude. That could be something that could be explored and put into your historical fiction novel. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Avoid stereotypes and cliches. You're all too talented to fall back on these. If you ever think that a voice says something that feels a little cliche, it probably is. So consider changing it down the road. Tip number six, don't overdo the vernacular. This is just a random example of what it looks like to overdo the vernacular that I came up with. I won't read it aloud, but you can read it. And I know that there are some authors who've been celebrated for this, like Mark Twain and William Faulkner. They really overdo the vernacular, and it's something you can try, but at some point it can get a little out of hand. So I recommend, like I said, with the examples of, say, Elmore Leonard or Cormac McCarthy, a little bit can go a long way towards establishing what someone sounds like without having everything sort of have to be written in this funny way. Tip number seven, this is very specific to historical fiction. Be aware of what expressions that we think of are common that are anachronistic in the world of your novel. I'll give you just one example of this from my own book. My novel takes place in 1492, and for a while, the characters would comment, in earlier drafts, the characters would comment that my main character had a big ego, which is a very common expression we use now. But later on, I was thinking, wait a minute, ego, isn't that a Freudian term? So I realized that it did not make sense within the world of the novel. And I instead they now say that he's too prideful, which would make sense for that time period. But little anachronisms like that can sneak into a historical fiction novel. So always be watching out for that. They're not always the easiest to find. I think I had a few drafts where I had big ego before I figured that out. Tip number 8, read books written during the time period of your novel. Try to figure out what it sounds like. And as we went over at the beginning with some of the books I tried to read, remember these books are they're old, they're antiquated, and we as readers have a different style that we like to read. So remember, you are writing for the 21st century reader, even though you're writing something that is historical. So you have to kind of find the gap between those. So tip number 9, I just have a few more of these for you. You don't get a voice by imitating someone else's, but imitation can be a good starting point. So, so for example, with myself, when I was trying to figure out the voice for South of Sephiroth, I wanted to find a voice that was a little older sounding, but description heavy. And, I couldn't find anything from my own time period, but I remembered reading Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, and how a book that takes place during the Civil War, and how beautifully it was written. And I just went back and read a few pages of that again, just kind of deconstruct how Crane was forming some of his sentences. And that helped me visualize and hear what the kind of voice I was going for sounded like. And I've never had anyone say to me like, "Oh, your novel just sounds like Stephen Crane," because that it doesn't. But it can be a great starting point to just get a visual reference or auditory reference of the kind of work that you want to write. Tip number 10, voice can relate to theme. There's a point the narrator wants to get across, they'll likely speak passionately about it. There's this quote from Orwell that I think is helpful for this kind of idea, so I'll read it out loud. My starting point is always a feeling of partisanship, a sense of injustice. When I sit down to write a book, I do not say to myself, I'm going to produce a work of art. I write it because there is some lie that I want to expose, some fact to which I want to draw attention, and my initial concern is to get a hearing. No, you don't need to go over the top with this, but it is a good way to think of how does your character feel about the world. It could help them have powerful conviction in the way that they talk. Tip number 11, voice more often comes from summary, not scene. And this is something that we saw with the sympathizer example earlier. So we're all going to, in our books, find moments where either two characters are talking to each other, or there's just some sort of stage direction that needs to be inserted, such as she walked across the room, or he picked up the apple. Don't always feel like with these little moments that you need to inject voice into them, because sometimes it's easier if they just speak for themselves. But voice is most helpful in non-scene situations, such as you have to give a summary of events that kind of pushes the narrative forward, interior monologue, or providing sensory details. Tip number 12, practice, practice, practice. I think this one's self-explanatory. But the more you practice, the more comfortable you get with voice, the more that this process will become more intuitive. And I'll say when I first started writing and trying to figure out voice, it wasn't easy. And there was a lot of times I would write and think, oh, should I really be writing this? Is this the right way to do this? And then over time, as I got more comfortable with it and confident, the voice started to come out more naturally, because this is a lifetime pursuit. And the more you keep at it, the more you practice, the more this will naturally flow. And last one, bonus tip is read, read, read. Seek out books with a strong voice if you want to write books with a strong voice, and pay attention to the techniques and mechanics that the author is using. I know a lot of people like to annotate as they read books to sort of find tips. I don't like to mark up my books, so sometimes if I find a really beautiful passage, I'll take a photo of it on my phone, or I'll even sometimes, write it down on a piece of paper in my notes app, just so I can reference it later and kind of get the feel of that voice. I remember this is a tip that a professor once gave me. You're only as good of a writer as you are a reader. So it's going to be the more you're reading, the kind of books that you want to write, the easier it's going to be to figure out how to write those books in turn. Say you can't write the great American novel if you haven't read a great American novel. And that's pretty much it for the presentation. My closing thoughts are, don't feel like you need to keep all these examples top of mind. You definitely don't have to write with this PowerPoint presentation opened. I think that overthinking can stall the process and make it too artificial. But hopefully, when you're writing and you've gotten a little ways in, and maybe if you feel a little stuck with the voice, you can go back and reference these notes or reference some of these examples and take a look, and that can help with figuring out maybe get you to the next point where you're trying to write. Anyways, that's all. I want to thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and let me know if you have any questions, and let's discuss how we can bolster the voice in your novel. Thank you.